Oh, this is great. Oh, so unfair. Um, that is so unfair. Yeah.
That's the trailer right
Yeah, no,
there.
no,
That's the trailer
really.
for the podcast.
I'm going to tell you the honest truth. The smartest person I've ever met is.
Hello, and welcome to the Ideas Sleep Furiously podcast. I'm Matt Archer. Well, this week, as you can probably tell from that fabulous teaser, we have a great episode for you. We've got Garett Jones on the show. Garett, if you don't know, is an economics professor at George Mason University. And he's also the author of 3 very interesting books. The first one, published in 2015, was titled Hive Mind, How Your Nation's IQ Matters So Much More Than Your Own. The second one, published in 2020, was titled 10% Less Democracy, Why You Should Trust Elites a Little More and the Masses a Little Less. And today we are talking with Garett about his latest book, and that's titled The Culture Transplant, How Migrants Make the Economies They Move to a Lot Like the Ones They Left. And after listening to this podcast, you should check out our review of Garett's book by George Francis on the Ideas Sleep Furiously Substack. That is linked down below. And speaking of the Substack, you should know that if you just watch the podcast, you listen to it on iTunes or whatever, the Substack is our primary project here at Ideas Sleep Furiously. We're trying to build a hub for heterodox social science, and in the next few months we're bringing on some major writers who you will have heard of. So at the moment, you pay $5 a month, or $50 a year, and that gets you access to things like the 3 bonus questions that we ask each guest at the end of the podcast. It gets you early access to the podcast, and many other things like live streams. But in January, to reflect the fact that we're going to be putting out better content and hopefully more content, we will be upping our subscription price from $5 a month to probably $6.99, which is very small increases. A couple of coffees for you, but it represents a massive increase for us, and it allows us to get better writers to pay our writers more. And of course, without your support, there's simply no way that a podcast and a publication like this could survive and thrive. So thank you to everybody who does support us. Remember that you can get this podcast on all the major podcasting platforms, but without further ado, I give you Garett Jones. Okay, we're here with Garett Jones. Garett, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for coming on.
Glad to be here.
So the first thing I thought we could do is maybe you could summarize this project that I guess is now finally finished. You've called it the Singapore Trilogy, the series of books. What's been your intention behind the 3 books?
Well, I really wanted to understand something about the wealth of nations, and what economists have spent a lot of the late 20th century working on was noticing that institutions really matter. And that government rules, the rules of the game, whether it's formal rules created by governments or whether it's informal rules that we might informally call culture. We've known that's important. And then the rise of what for us in econ was big data let us start answering these questions in a much more rigorous way. So my goal was to really sort of pull together a lot of this academic research, some of which I've contributed to, and explain it in books that people who didn't read papers with a lot of Greek letters could actually understand. So the reason I call them the Singapore Trilogy is because Singapore is a running theme through these books. The first book, Hive Mind, about IQ, there Singapore plays an important role because it has some of the highest test scores in the world, a country with a lot of sharp folks. The second book, 10% Less Democracy, Why You Should Trust Elites a Little More and the Masses a Little Less. There, Singapore is like a super extreme version of where a nation, if it gets really lucky, might be able to go with a sort of oligarchical, sort of aristocratic style of government. And this last book, The Culture Transplant, there, Singapore is a country that's that's been heavily shaped by the descendants of Chinese migrants who've moved there over the centuries.
So you're in an elevator. You've got, let's say, 30 seconds to explain your latest book. What is the pitch?
The pitch is that migrants make the countries they move to a lot like the places they came from. The world hasn't changed much since 1500 once you account for migration. Places where a lot of Western Europeans went ended up kind of a lot economically like Western Europe. Places that a lot of Chinese migrants went ended up a lot like they realized the dreams of the Ming Dynasty. China now is only catching up to the economic successes of other Chinese majority countries like Singapore and Taiwan. So it's important to realize that migration creates cultural persistence and that full assimilation is a myth.
Do you think that people are generally then in, say, Anglo societies like America and the UK, they generally hold the opposite view? I mean, I'm trying to think of what the most perhaps prominent arguments would be that migrants wouldn't change the destination that much. So maybe, well, smarter people tend to go. The fact that they want to go in the first place shows that they've got a different personality. American culture is everywhere, and they might think, oh, the UK, America, that looks like a cool place, and therefore they're less traditional. These are, I assume, the type of arguments that you get given.
Well, a lot of people would just say, well, if people start speaking the language of the home country, that means they've assimilated, or that's a very strong sign they've assimilated. And it's true. People once they move to America, their kids are going to speak English, right? I mean, that's just overwhelmingly likely. People who move from the rest of the world to Germany are going to learn to speak German. So if you're interested in these sort of what I would think of as superficial cultural indicators, whether they eat the local food, whether they speak the local language, there's going to be a ton of assimilation. But I'm interested in whether people assimilate fully or almost fully on traits like trust, on savings rates, on attitudes toward government. Do you think the government should take care of you, or do you think you should take care of yourself? That's a classic survey question. And that's one question where people tend to import a lot of the attitudes from their home country, and those attitudes last at least to the second generation.
Okay, this is a good place then to launch into trust, which is what you start off with, I think, in the first chapter. So you mentioned something that is no secret to economists, that trust is crucial for economic productivity and really social prosperity more broadly. You also mentioned trustworthiness. So I wanted to ask you first, why is trust important? Is it just important to the extent that it's a proxy for trustworthiness, or is it separate as sort of a personality trait that's important? And I'll maybe just mention examples where we have high trust populations and low trust populations. So Sweden and Somalia might be on opposite ends of the spectrum of trust. And we see that in both Sweden and Somalia, and in places like Minnesota, where you have Swedes and Somalians now living together in different parts of Minnesota. And they do seem to act a little bit, at least, like they do in their home countries. So why is trust important to prosperity, productivity? Is it trust or trustworthiness? What happens when you take a low trust population and move them to a high trust population? That's a lot.
Well, first off, I don't know particularly Somali trust data, but I do know that sub-Saharan African trust data, according to surveys like the World Values Survey, widely used, shows very low levels of average trust in sub-Saharan Africa. So, this is a case where the rational economic man, the person who's this sort of stereotype of textbooks, that person should be really untrustworthy, right? So basically, being untrustworthy is, in an important sense, the rational thing to do, right? Like if I am a selfish person and I know I'm surrounded by selfish people, which is sort of what economics is built around, low levels of trust are actually the rational outcome. Being trusting and being trustworthy even more so, that's sort of the Pollyanna approach. That's sort of naive, that's childish, that's something you're taught as a nursery rhyme or something. But the cynical thing to do, the homo economicus thing to do, is to be untrustworthy and untrusting. So this is, now it turns out, of course, as you suggested, that being trusting and being trustworthy seems to be important for building large-scale human cooperation. And the great successes of productivity that we've had, whether it's Adam Smith's pin factory that he wrote about in 1776, a dozen or so people making pins out of pieces of steel, or people working together in a firm and finishing their jobs on time, even though they know there's very little chance of getting fired if they cheat a little and screw things up a little bit. Trusting and trustworthy behavior is really crucial toward the large tasks we take on in firms, and even more so in politics. I mean, a lot of politics just relies, as we saw after 2020, if one politician just says, I don't believe these electoral outcomes, a sizable portion of that politician's voter base will say, well, yeah, you're right. It doesn't make sense to trust these voting outcomes. So just having a politician who trusts the system and who visibly acts like he trusts the system, turns out to be an important part of helping the system work in a smooth way.
Garett, what's the correlation with intelligence, by the way? Because I know, Johnny, you cited Garett's research on this in your own book. So is it a small correlation, moderate correlation with national IQ? And if you have a group of MIT physicists, are you going to see, on average, that they're more trustworthy?
I will take the trusting side of that question because that's the way questions usually phrased.
Yep.
I'd say with a lot of these things, as with a lot of these things, it's going to be a small to moderate correlation, by which I mean like 0.4 or less. So at the micro level, at the individual level, if you survey, say, all of Americans and do that kind of survey, that's the kind of correlation you're going to find. It could be as low as 0.2. I don't quote me on this. Now, it's been a couple of years since I paid attention to the IQ a lot. But but at the cross-country level, these correlations zip up and increase, partly because you're averaging the scores across many people, and because you're looking at entire cultures, right? People kind of learn the culture they live in. So higher, it does turn out, for instance, that higher intelligence is a higher average national IQ, higher average test scores are really robust predictors of government quality and of low government corruption, which would be our classic econ illustration of trusting and trustworthy behavior. Government corruption is one of these classic measures.
Yeah, so I want to push a little bit on this is really a philosophical claim more than anything else, on the distinction between trust and trustworthiness. Yeah, so like people like David Gautier in philosophy made an entire career on essentially arguing that disposing yourself to be worthy of trust, by which he meant something like cooperating in iterated prisoner's dilemmas, even when there are incentives to defect, is the kind of trait that, well, it's partly genetic, it's partly under our control, but it's the kind of trait that, when cultivated, can make your life go better as an individual, and can also predict, social productivity, successful relationships. And so here's a simple example. You've got an iterated or repeated prisoner's dilemma, and there are often going to be incentives. Let's say you're in a relationship, it's marriage or something like that, or you're in a relationship with your bank or your grocery store. And you might be making a purchase at the store and the clerk turns his back, and you could easily get away with just pocketing the money and the goods and walking away. Mm-hmm. And Gautier kind of says, actually, it's irrational to cultivate that disposition under certain circumstances, because if everyone did that, it's likely that you're not going to have those kinds of relationships. And the usual response by economists is, well, you're not everyone. And so it could still be perfectly rational.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on this? And this is kind of a deep. Yeah, exactly. Trust versus trustworthiness. And is it trustworthiness that promotes prosperity, or is it trust? And
Yeah. So this is, in my heart, there's a certain part of me. I was raised Mormon LDS. And there's a part of me that just really wants to embrace the deontological argument for that you are a better person, and it's virtuous to be a better person who is trustworthy. You get to carry something through your life that you can respect yourself throughout the course of your life. This is something where in modern econ, if you get this anywhere, you're going to get it from being exposed to, of all things, Randian thought, objectivism, right? Objectivism celebrates what they call selfishness. But then you read like half a page of it and they say, oh, no, it's always irrational and immoral to be selfish in a way that hurts anyone else. Like, oh,
right.
You just defined selfishness as embodying all these Aristotelian virtues, right? You crammed it into the definition. So I'm with you that there's something noble about this. Let me brag about myself here. One time I rented a car, and at the end of the car rental, I'm cleaning through the car, looking for my plugs and everything. And I found an envelope that said rent deposit, and inside was like $4,000 in cash, right? And I had to decide what to do. So I went and asked to talk to the manager because I didn't want to, just hand it to the first person I talked to. When I mentioned that on my Facebook back when I had that, like a lot of people told me, wow, that's, I think, better than I would have done. So, but I knew what kind of person I wanted to be. That building a society, the question is, when societies get this as a whole, are they getting it through the process of encouraging self-reflection? Is that the button you press to get it? Is it having higher levels of intelligence that helps to get it? Is it the right levels of preaching by religious leaders that helps to get it? What's the sort of R squared, as statisticians would call it? What's the statistical power of each of those channels? And I don't know all of them, but I do know that the question is so important, we should latch on to any channel we have. And that's part of the reason that I spent quite a bunch of my time studying IQ and now migration.
You could, of course, throw in personality traits there too, although those are difficult to study. Yeah. We know they're moderately heritable, but it's really hard to figure out what's even going on there.
Yeah, and I
okay, cool. Yeah,
I personally still have my doubts about a lot of these cross-country measures of personality, more so than with intelligence. Both have their problems, but with personality, I think it's harder.
I could spend days on this topic. I guess I will push just one more, just one more follow-up to this, and then we'll get back to the book.
No.
There's this old thought experiment. Actually, David Godier had, an interlocutor named Gregory Kafka, and they both wrote books about Thomas Hobbes. And basically, as you know, Hobbes also is cited by economists. He's sort of he's the arch individualist. He wants to argue you into following rules from individual self-interest and that sort of thing. And so trust and trustworthiness is crucial for Hobbes's argument. And I'll just sort of leave the audience with this. Maybe you can respond. We'll get back to the book. But, there's this thought experiment Kafka develops, and it's something like this. There's an eccentric billionaire, and he tells you, look, what I want you to do is form the intention by midnight tonight to drink this bottle of toxin tomorrow morning. And what this toxin will do is it'll make you mildly ill. You might vomit, you might feel really bad for a day, right? But if you form the intention by midnight tonight to drink the vial of toxin tomorrow, then what I'm going to do is at midnight tonight, I have this ability to read your mind, some machine to do that. I'm going to put $1 million into your bank account. And then I'm going to ask you tomorrow at, let's call it noon, to go ahead and decide, are you going to drink the toxin or not, right? And I mean, you think, okay, this is obvious. If I can do it, I'll form the intention tonight. The $1 million gets put into my bank or it doesn't. And then I have the choice to drink the toxin or not. No sane person would drink this toxin. Godier says, you know what? He bites the bullet against Kafka and he says, actually, the kinds of people who are successful in the world and who enjoy successful marriages and friendships are the kinds of people who dispose themselves to drink the toxin. Mm-hmm. Drink the toxin. It's not irrational. And I think you understand the setup here, which is intentions aren't fully under our control. Mm-hmm. Commitments, trustworthiness isn't fully under control. But to the extent that it is, we should try to dispose ourselves in such circumstances to be trustworthy. So here is this is way outside of your book, but it's relevant to the trust and trustworthiness distinction. Do you think drinking toxin or being the kind of person who drinks toxin is insane? Is it rational? What do you think here?
I agree with you that ability is crucial to social success. And Ed Prescott, the Nobel laureate who just passed away about a week ago, hit one of the ideas that got him the Nobel Prize, rules rather than discretion, was about this commitment problem. It's about how hard it is to make, how hard and how indeed irrational it is to make internal commitments that are both good for you and good for the group. And you could frame it just as the story you said there, right? Where you can make the world better off.
Yeah.
So this is a huge problem, and having people who are willing to irrationally sacrifice for the greater good and solve these collective action problems that's crucial to explaining not just the wealth of nations, but just human flourishing more broadly.
Cool. Yeah, and this is where philosophy, economics, and evolutionary biology come together. Mm-hmm. Because for many years, Darwin, Nozick, there are a lot of people who think in evolutionary terms and think, look, the name of the game, of course, for our ancestors was solving collective action problems. One way to do it was to develop moral emotions. And of course, they can be cultivated socially, but at the genetic level too, we can be predisposed through these evolutionary processes to behave in ways and dispose ourselves to behave in ways that are, strictly speaking, irrational from the moment of time we're talking about, right?
And
so
we've created whole species that are good at doing this. I mean, people can train dogs to sacrifice themselves for a greater good.
Exactly.
So we know that we can change those moral emotions for those around us. And
Right.
it seems to be an ingredient in
Yeah.
human flourishing. Yeah.
Cool. Well, speaking of moral emotions and sort of solving collective action problems, well, we've got this fundamental unit called the family. And you mentioned at the end of chapter 1 and 2 that there can be, well, first of all, attitudes toward the family affect national prosperity. And I guess I'll go ahead and read a quick quote. You say, who doesn't love a close-knit family? The grinding hand of capitalism, that's who, right? And then you go on after a few paragraphs to say, sadly, stronger family values predict poorer families, poorer meaning economically poorer. So what is going on here? Why would stronger family values, what do you mean by this, predicts less economic prosperity?
Yeah, basically, trusting your family and deciding to sacrifice for your family means, in practice, sacrificing the willingness to follow general rules. So this is the question of, if your brother commits a crime, like a violent crime or a theft, would you call the police to report them, right? So I remember a long time ago, the Unabomber was the way he was discovered by the authorities was because his brother reported him to the police. He says, these Unabomber essays sound just like what my brother writes. And that's how he was found. So he was ratted out by his brother. And I remember listening to a talk show host, actually G. Gordon Liddy at the time. I listened to him saying, what an immoral thing it is to do, to rat out your own brother, to betray him to the police. Yeah. Blood should be so important to you that you would never do that. And of course, every mafia story that is told in our culture ends up turning on the same axis: abstract rules of human flourishing versus the people that I'm socially connected to. And if you look at the economic prosperity of Sicily today, you get a sense very glibly of where those kind of values take you, right? I mean, it's a generalization, but there's good economics underneath that. So yeah, family values, willingness to follow, willingness to care about your team at the expense of abstract norms. That's perfectly, it's emotionally rational. It's evolutionarily stable in some sort of ESS sense. Nevertheless, it's not how humans built prosperity.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we might add an example here where, take a country like the United States, it's probably the most extreme in this way, and then take an average or a poor Latin American country. And you mentioned Latin America in the next chapter, we'll get to that. But yeah, I mean, the probability that you'll stay at home, especially if you're a girl, and live with your parents until you get married off in Latin America is pretty high. And the US is pretty low. And so what you see is people moving to, really far away from family in order to take the best job they can. And I guess your point in this chapter is that's actually a pretty good prediction for economic prosperity, but it doesn't necessarily mean the family is optimally happy either, right? So is there a trade-off, do you think, between economic success and maybe happiness in this sense of happiness, right? We derive happiness from many things, but is there actually a downside to economic prosperity if this is true?
I think at the collective level, you can watch how people vote with their feet, and it turns out that basically sacrificing romantic visions of the nuclear family for the sake of a functioning electrical system and a sewage system that works is a trade-off that people are really willing to make. It just seems, it's clear.
Yeah.
And I want to say that to politicize this a bit, I think that this is part of where a lot of the new right in America has come down. They've come down on the side of romanticizing the family. I think Orrin Cass and his group, I think called American Compass. This is about romanticizing these familistic values over the individualistic market.
Okay, but let me challenge you on that really quickly here, because as you know, as an economist, individual rationality and collective prosperity can come apart. Obvious examples, public goods, prisoners' dilemmas, et cetera. So, I mean, I could at least hypothetically imagine a situation where we all pursue our interests. We take the best paying job because that's what's expected of us, because there's an opportunity to do that. But if we could rewrite the social norms of our society, we'd write them. I guess this is the new right. This is their point. We'd write them such that the incentives are not to do that. Once you hit a threshold of we have a functioning electrical grid, we have enough to eat, then maybe from a social standpoint, the optimal choice is to move back toward the nuclear family once that threshold is hit. Mm-hmm. And yet, we might call it runaway capitalism or whatever, gives us these individual incentives to act in ways that actually make us collectively unhappy. Why is that not true?
I think the reason that's not true, at least at the aggregate level, is because people aren't doing this just for a slightly better cell phone. Or even if they are individually doing it for a slightly better cell phone, at the aggregate level over the long run, you notice, this tends to accompany better health care, better opportunities to experience great culture, better opportunities to, hang out with your family in a comfortable way and watch your parents grow old in a more comfortable situation, right? So it's really is a short run versus long run. If you just nitpick about people are doing all this for a faster cell phone, that's missing the point.
Yeah, very good point. And that's a little bit like GDP. Some of the bad criticisms of GDP is like, okay, well, we can just go to war and raise GDP, or we can create all kinds of destructive ways of temporarily boosting GDP, and that's not good for us, is it? Right?
Yeah, like making people
and the usual response is
yeah.
The usual response is GDP includes what? Education, healthcare, all the things that make our lives go better. Right?
Yeah, I mean, if you forced everyone to work, 16 hours a day, you would increase GDP. I don't know any economist who is in favor of this. So, but in the normal range of variation, just look where migrants want to go and where they want to stay. So
exactly. Okay, good. Let's see. So I wanted to transition to the next chapter. And this is, again, moving from sort of this trade-off between family values, so to speak, in one sense of that word, and prosperity. You give the example of Latin America. And this is where, in the next chapter, where you develop this concept of a nation's SAT score. So I'll ask you to kind of describe that in a minute. But let me start off with a quote here. So you mentioned that the ancestry of the people matter more than the history of the place. You already opened with that example. We look at places like Australia, Canada, the US, they look a lot more like Western Europe than they do like Latin America, even though their history is a little bit closer to Latin America in the sense of Native Americans and so on. So one way in which, one implication of this is you say today the nations in Latin America that tend to be the poorest tend to be those with the largest percentage of Native American descent. Okay, and so we've got European populations, we've got a lot of mixture with mestizos, and then we've got the sort of native population. And your thesis is more or less that when we look at the ancestry of these populations, that matters more than the history of the place. And I guess the way that you measure that is with the nation's SAT score. So what is that, and what are the implications here for the SAT score?
Yeah, so this is drawing on data and statistics that were first reported by Potterman and Weil at Brown and Bill Easterly at NYU, all of which are great writers who I recommend. And what Potterman and Weil did is they went and collected data on how long different regions of the world before 1500 had spent with their population living under organized states, that's the S, or living under settled agriculture, that's A. And then Bill Easterly came along and with a team created estimates of, in the year 1500, basically what fraction of the world's best technology were the people in that region using. So that's the T in the T-score, technology. So S, A, and T. If you just average those together for each country in the old world, that does a pretty good job of predicting how prosperous those regions are today. Now, the question is, well, how does migration affect this? And so Potterman and Weil went to great efforts to create a measure of basically who's moved where since 1500. And this migration matrix, which you can find on Professor Weil's website, on Professor Potterman's website at Brown, really did a great job double checking, kicking the tires on these numbers. This migration index, it's widely used by scholars. And so the question is, if you're trying to predict prosperity in the new world, would you rather know the history of the place, the SAT score of the place, or would you rather know the SAT score of the ancestors of the people who live there now? And unambiguously, as all these researchers have found, it's the history of peoples that matters more than the history of places. And again, the tires have been kicked on this by quite a few critics since this was all published in journals in 2010. So we're looking at literature that's been there for a dozen years. Just this week, the American Sociological Review, the flagship journal of the American Sociological Association, published a paper using the same data to look at cross-country differences in murder rates. So this has become quite mainstream, and it's something that deserves to be part of our public consciousness.
That's incredible that a sociology journal published some of this stuff, because obviously it's at least a little bit controversial.
Yeah, if the Twitter discussions of it online among scholars were really respectful and
that's
thoughtful.
great.
I was very happy to see that. This is maybe my colleague Tyler Cowan is correct, and peak wokeness is behind us.
Let's hope so. Okay, well, let's see here. I want to move to the next chapter, unless you have a question here, Matt. And
no, you power through the book. This is great.
Yeah, this is fantastic so far. Well, going from a little bit controversial to even more controversial. Although this is not your own research, you're citing other people's well-replicated research, Robert Putnam and others. You say that when we get more ethnic diversity, we tend to get less trust. And that, of course, is important if your story is correct, which is higher levels of trust tend to predict more prosperity and so on. Now, I know you're actually, you're a fan of a certain kind and amount of immigration and so on. And you look at Singapore and you think, look, this is actually, this is a pretty good success story. So let me just quote you really quickly here. You mentioned that Robert Putnam found out that one strong predictor of whether you as an individual were trusting of others was whether you were in an ethnically diverse neighborhood. The higher the local diversity, the lower the trust. And then you later conclude, and again, this is empirical research from lots of other people. You say that economists conclude that ethnic diversity seems to lead to a shift from public spending on public goods, things like environmental cleanup and so on, to the public provision of private goods, arguably because the latter can be targeted to particular ethnic groups. So this is, I guess it's not controversial empirically, but I think it would be controversial to say maybe in a sociology department, generally speaking. What are the implications of this? Like, is this an argument for, against immigration? Is it a neutral argument? What do you take the implications of these statements to be?
Well, first of all, I should point out the sort of magnitude of these effects of diversity per se appears to be smaller and a bit more fragile. It's substantially more fragile than the results I report early in the book. So, and part of this is because it's hard to measure different kinds of diversity, I think. So, for instance, I place a lot of weight in looking at the business literature on diversity, partly because because businesses have an incentive to make money wherever they can. So if diversity is truly an unalloyed strength along every dimension, they certainly have an incentive to exploit that, right, in the crudest way possible, right? So, and there the literature has been careful in sorting between different measures of diversity, whether it's age diversity, gender diversity, skill diversity, or ethnic diversity would be four big ones. And based on experimental and more or less just correlation style evidence, it does appear that skill diversity is really an unambiguous positive, right? I call this firefly diversity, if you've ever seen the Joss Whedon show. So basically, if you have a ragtag bag of misfits coming together to work on something, the way for that to work is for the ragtag bag to have different skills, right? Someone who's good at fixing engines, someone who's the hired gun, someone who's the manager, someone who can talk to secret spirits or whatever. Sort of like early Star Trek Next Generation stuff, right? So skill diversity, unalloyed good, where there are going to be frictions, but they work out. Ethnic diversity is it's very much harder to find unambiguous net evidence that it's a positive. Sometimes negative, sometimes zero. The common phrase in the business literature, which people can look up online, is not that diversity is our strength. Instead, the more common phrase is the double-edged sword of diversity. And we know what that metaphor means, right? It's that if you use it the wrong way, it could hurt you. So I think that romanticizing diversity has been a mistake, and looking at more clinical, empirically driven versions of it will make us just be a little more cautious. I don't think it's swamps the zone in any sense in terms of wiping out any other benefits. But we should definitely not romanticize when we can use science to give us just a reason for caution.
Good. Yeah. And you've seen this, like I have. A lot of academics cite the so-called Hong-Page theorem, which suggests that more diverse groups tend to perform tasks better. And yeah, my response has always been, well, that's interesting. It's a neat model, and it's probably true if we pick out the right kind of diversity, cognitive diversity, personality trait diversity,
skill diversity.
and we probably do get some of that with that ethnic diversity, but it's a really imperfect correlation. And so often policymakers and presidents of universities, diversity is our strength. They're conflating lots of different kinds, and it's really too bad, because diversity is good in certain ways, right?
Yes.
And so it would be nice to figure out what those ways are.
The lazy conflation of different measures of important concepts is a bad practice across the social sciences, right? So conflating skill diversity with ethnic diversity and just blurring the results of both studies together in a lit review, bad practice. In my field, my original field, monetary economics, people blend together all these different measures of money and just treat them as interchangeable when they're doing bad work. When you're doing good work, you say, which measure of money is captures the greatest measure, is the best measure of moneyness. So there's imprecisely measured concepts are the bane of bad social science.
Yeah. Garett, I'm wondering how you kind of marry the thesis here, right? The diversity thesis, I guess, really originating with Putnam, and the idea of we need less democracy and more elites, because it seems that elites are wedded. Most of them, again, I'm speaking mainly about the Anglosphere, are wedded to diversity because they are the beneficiaries of it. Whereas obviously, my country is a really good example, Brexit, right? That it's hard to tease out what's going on there, but it seemed like the anti-immigration sentiment was a key driver, right? In these coastal towns which hadn't seen investment, a lot of people make the economic argument, but people like David Goodhart and Matt Goodwin in the UK have written a lot about this, and they say, actually, they think it's mainly a cultural issue. So do you have any thoughts about the how you marry those two ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that within elite institutions, ethnic diversity works quite well, and part of the reason it does is because there's a lot of selection mechanisms where you basically you're looking at a highly skilled group already, right? And you've already filtered out people who are really weak at cooperating, and therefore you're lowering the costs of in-group negotiation in quite highly ethnically diverse groups. Like, for instance, among economists, right? Like the culture we share is that we're all economists. So ethnic differences subside dramatically when you're on, I presume, the Federal Reserve Board. Certainly true within economics departments. The shared culture overcomes a lot of these difficulties. I guess you could, if I wanted to romanticize this, I'd say that the way to let me point this out. Actually, it relates to research in the area. It turns out that where you really appear at the net cross-country level to get the bad outcomes, the bad social outcomes from diversity, things that look like civil war, social conflict. That's when cultural diversity, when ethnic diversity and cultural diversity are correlated. Basically, when values are paired closely with ethnicity. So basically, people are all looking at signals. We're all very lazy. We're all cognitively lazy. And so if it turns out that basically people who look different from me also on average are of a different religion than me, that makes it much easier for a culture to create, unfortunately, social conflict, right? So it's that correlation between values and ethnicity that seems to be associated with bad social outcomes. So I really don't know how much elites are totally wedded to diversity at all costs in some level. I mean, a lot of this is just public posing. For instance, it's worth pointing out that after 2015 in Europe during the refugee crisis, once the European elites saw how voters were very opposed to 1 million people a year coming across the Mediterranean, European elites just stopped that, right? So the EU, the embodiment of, supposedly, according to people on the right, the embodiment of all these sort of DEI values or whatever, they embraced an incredibly harsh anti-immigration policy with the kind of harshness that Donald Trump and his followers can only dream of, right? So,
But can I push back on that a little? Because in my country, you've seen after Brexit, a populist, for all intents and purposes, elected in Boris Johnson. Get Brexit done.
yeah.
That's the message. And again, Matt Goodwin, great Substack, I recommend it wholeheartedly to people, has documented that the immigration laws, as I guess you would expect, right? Because the main immigration when we're in the EU is coming from the EU. London is the second largest French city in the world. 300,000 French people live there, right? So of course you're going to see more immigration coming in from outside the EU. Okay, people like Nigel Farage talked about the desire to bring more people in from the Commonwealth and the such, but you actually saw more of what people didn't want. And so what I would say is it's not necessarily some type of conspiracy theory, is that they just don't care, right? The elites don't care. They're not affected by it. Take one controversial example. In towns in the middle of England, you see large Bangladeshi and Pakistani communities, and that is where overwhelmingly there's what they call co-sanguineous diseases, right? Because you have a lot of first and second cousin marriages. So it all kind of comes from this one place in the UK. Okay, do elites care about that? I don't think they're thinking, right, let's have more of that. It doesn't affect them.
Well,
right?
I would push back by pointing out that voters themselves, I think, have very mixed views on immigration. I think it's a lot like views on abortion, where there are, depending on how you phrase the question, it's really hard to tell what they want, right? They definitely don't want anything unpleasant to happen. This is something that Donald Trump learned once. I don't know if he learned it. Or does he learn anything? But Republicans who watched American politics saw this happen once Donald Trump tried enforcing the border and tried doing this or that different policies. Voters, the masses of voters, became very uncomfortable with anything unpleasant happening to migrants, right? So it quickly became clear that the Republicans were not going to get their dream of millions of people being put on buses and sent back to their home countries. And it was because the voters did not want that. So if there's one thing that we know from a lot of voting theory, it's that voters are of two minds on many issues. Partly that's because of their own internal contradictions, and partly that's all this fancy, arrows and possibility theorem stuff. But I think people have tormented views on fraught questions like immigration and abortion. And politicians, you could say politicians have to find a way to reconcile our own internal contradictions. So don't be surprised if they resolve those contradictions in favor of the status quo.
Okay, well, speaking about borders, some of your colleagues and some of, our mutual friends, Brian Kaplan, Jason Brennan, Michael Humer, these are sort of the arch open borders advocates, right? And they really are for basically open borders.
Yeah.
Other than, maybe criminals, people who have violated the law, they think, okay, maybe governments have reasons to stop them. Otherwise, they really do mean it when they advocate open borders. But of course, they understand you can't have both open borders and a welfare state, as Milton Friedman and others have argued. And so their usual response is, well, let's open the borders and shut down the welfare state. And I've always found this a little bit odd, because when you open the borders, you tend to get more of a welfare state for lots of reasons. But I wanted to tie this into your argument and get your thoughts. Maybe this is too much of a softball, so I'll push back. But, if there is this trade-off between ethnic diversity, which we would get, of course, with open borders, and the corruption, let's say, of the production of public goods. So instead of more public goods, you actually tend to get more private goods, right? Different ethnic groups vying for different private goods, maybe under the guise of public goods. Is it even possible to have a situation where we have open borders or nearly open borders and having a demand for less of a welfare state? Is that possible? Is this, what do you think here?
No, it's not possible at all. This is open borders advocates like to assume their answers a lot, and we economists are often mocked for assuming the answer. We often use mathematical tricks to find ways to build our answer into the assumption.
Yes.
And
yes,
a lot of policymakers, a lot of policy dreamers do this as well. Let's assume the can opener, to use the old joke. Let's assume the can opener of a an open borders migration policy combined with a permanent ban on welfare. Like, that's just never going to happen, right? I don't have to appeal to the late Ed Prescott to make this point, that basically people can make promises today that they will want to break tomorrow, right? This happens to all of us internally, even in the best of times. And if migrants who are coming tend to be poorer than average, at least for a few decades, it's easy to imagine that when they vote, they will be voting to increase the welfare state on average. And so this is just like an impossible equilibrium. So like, it's a dream. That's not central to my case.
So maybe
it's weird that people can get away with talking like that.
Yeah, I've thought, of course, I agree, but I want to push back just to at least give a counter argument. I mean, in the public choice tradition, maybe they would say something like, look, if this is your worry, then just constitutionalize it. Basically, somehow at the constitutional level, we have to have institutions, formal institutions set up that makes it very difficult to increase the size of the welfare state. That's the solution. So do that and then open the border. What's wrong with that?
Because promises, constitutions are what the Constitution means is decided by 5 justices on the Supreme Court, right? So the written rules are less important than the enforced rules down the road. Again, I don't really mind. America's a rich enough country, we could afford to expand the welfare state for a lot of folks and make it quite generous. We shouldn't assume the can opener of commitment. Commitment is something to be analyzed, to be questioned, to be explained, not something to be assumed. I mean, just look at all the people who've tried to stick to their diets, right? They have failed to keep their commitments. So this is something that happens to humans everywhere, and it happens to governments everywhere. And the question of stable commitment is one of the great questions of all the social sciences, and it should not be assumed away.
Good. Yeah. Well, let's see here. I had one more question about the conclusion before we get to the 3 final questions that Matt always asks to guests here. And let's see here. So, you mentioned, you talk a lot about SAT scores and migration patterns, and these are good predictors of prosperity. And then you end with a metaphor here. So I'll just ask you to maybe expand on it, and we'll get to the 3 final questions. You end with a quote from the movie Thor Ragnarok, and you say, Asgard is not a place, it's a people. So what do you mean by this? What's going on?
Yeah, so if you've seen the movie Thor Ragnarok, or you kind of know what happened in the MCU, you know that basically Thor helped to destroy his own planet, right? In order to save his people. So his original planet was destroyed completely, but yet it was obvious that the people of Asgard, right? These sort of these space Vikings, were going to continue to exist, and they were going to take their culture to a new place. And they did. And they took it to actually a little place in Norway. And so, as multiple characters in the movie noted, it was clear that the destruction of a place did not mean the destruction of the people. It meant that their culture would persist, and they could carry it from an old land to a new, and that they would not assimilate to the culture of their new place. They would instead carry Asgardian space Viking values to a new place.
Right. So maybe an example historically would illustrate this. So we have this counterfactual. I guess before World War II, obviously there were Jews looking to return to Israel, what they called Israel or what the British called Palestine. And there was actually a plan at one point, both before and after the war, if this wasn't viable because there are already Arabs, Palestinians, and so on living there, maybe they should go to Alaska or some other part of the world. And I guess the prediction of your book is that even if they ended up Eastern European Jews in Alaska, Alaska would actually look a lot more like Israel than Alaska. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that would have been great. I would just absolutely have. It would have been great for me selfishly, right? Because it would have been closer. A lot easier for me to get to. So
because it would have been a prosperous
Alaskans
place.
would have been much better off if they could have had that happen to them, right? That would have been a great gift to them.
Yeah.
To import Israeli culture would have been fantastic.
Fair enough. Okay, and you open with an anecdote with your Jewish grandmother, so I'll close with the Israeli anecdote.
Yes.
So yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, so we've got a few audience questions before we turn to our three special questions. So the audience questions, the first one is, what proportion, this is a bit cheeky, which proportion of his own findings does he think will replicate?
Oh, yeah. I think the first 2/3 of the book will turn out to be really robust, right? I think all of the SAT score migration matrix stuff that people carry values from their old to their new will hold up as long as we are recognizable humans, right? If my colleague Robin Hanson turns out to be right and robots end up taking over the world, maybe that's a different world. But until then, all of that, the cultural persistence, this is going to last. And again, part of the reason it'll last is because I'm careful about saying some cultural values persist a lot and some vanish completely, and most are in the middle. So that range of variation is going to hold up. I think the cultural diversity stuff, whether cultural diversity turns out to be a strength or a weakness in different settings, different business settings, different government settings, that is more fragile. So I think I have the right hedges in the right chapters of the book.
Yeah, that's interesting because we just finished a podcast with Razib Khan the other day, and he thinks speciation is on the cards potentially by the end of the century. So your book may have a few years, but then we're going to turn into pigmen, as I think you liked that video on Twitter, Garett. So maybe you're going to have to revise it once the speciation.
We should be clear.
That's what I want. I want the robot to.
Yeah. Of course, to be clear, this is about massive embryo selection and the use of CRISPR-Cas9, not just migration patterns that Razib is talking about.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So the next question, again, another cheeky one. What do you think about p-values? So this questioner went through a few of the studies in 10%. That's democracy. And he said, actually, a few of these studies, he didn't think the p-values were high enough. Do you think that, what is your take generally on that
I am
type of
1,000% McCloskeyan. Deirdre McCloskey is absolutely
Do you want to
right.
explain that to people?
So p-values are overrated. Obsessing over p-values is, to put a joke on it, the standard error of regressions. And it's going to be common for p-values to be low when we're looking at small samples and moderate correlations. I mean, you can just go online and look at any p-value calculator. But when you see something showing up in 10, 20 different studies using a bunch of different measures, a bunch of different proxies for your underlying variables of interest, that's a sign that your real p-value is a lot higher. So this is, and in 10% less democracy in particular, we know that, for instance, the value of central bank independence, having central banks run by oligarchs, doesn't stand up to a lot of statistical significance tests. But when you run normal regressions. But whenever you look at a case study and you're like, one country switched from democratically run central banks to insider run central banks, the inflation rate falls. So there are different kinds of knowing and different kinds of learning, and that can complement each other. So before and after case studies can tell us a lot that a bunch of fancy data regressions can't tell us. So yeah, obsession over asterisks is a huge mistake, both for good and ill. It's weird that people p-hack. I mean, it's disappointing because it's unsurprising that people p-hack because editors and reviewers are lazy and they obsess over that. But we can learn a lot from multiple studies in the same field that have p equal 0.06.
Yeah. Obviously, incentives to publish too. So yeah, that can.
Yeah, it's disappointing that happens. I mean, editors can do bad things on that. So again, Deirdre McCloskey is the person on this. The Cult of Statistical Significance is her best non-technical book on the question. Right.
Cool.
Next audience question. Economics is slowly turning woke. What does Garett plan to do about this? What is the future for economics?
This is, to people in the audience who aren't keeping track of what's going on, I mean, I don't have a deep knowledge of this, but the fact that our annual convention is going to require both vaccination and N95 masks at all times is kind of a sign of something that's not really evidence-based. It's more cultural, I think. Disappointing.
Yeah.
That's the AEA meetings. I mean, part of it is that there are other organizations. The AEA is getting kind of woke, but we can also have other organizations that just are focused on science more and that don't kind of obsess over this. I don't want to name any names right now, because I don't want to single anybody out as being the bad guy, because that's how the internet works. But we have plenty of organizations that have stuck to the science, and people can have great careers publishing in them. And that's where I think a lot of us should place our focus. Also write books.
Actually, this is
also write books, because publishers, academic publishers, really love books by economists still. If you're trying to reach an audience and you can write at an 11th grade level, according to those readability indexes, you can get an audience. So,
yep. As Freakonomics showed, On that note, Garett, we spoke to Richard Hanania a couple of weeks ago, and obviously this is someone who chose to leave academia and go I guess the Substack route. We asked him if he would recommend this route to other people, and if he thinks Johnny pressed him on how critical he is of the academy. And I think we tend to both think he overdoes it somewhat and perhaps overestimates the success that people like him can have outside of the academy, and therefore it's still kind of worth pushing for some intellectual diversity in the Ivies in the UK, in the US, and the Russell Group in the UK. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think that people young wannabe Garett Joneses should be looking to go to universities like George Mason, or should they pursue an alternative path?
No, I think that it's econ is a great place to be. I think that it's still intellectually very open. I would recommend the field to anyone. If you're the kind of person who is going to be really upset by anyone ever criticizing you, you can't be in academia. I've had a couple of, I have one rejection letter from a journal that I've saved in my archives, right? But it's only one. It's one that was the person just shouldn't have said that. But it's just one. And I've been published well. People have treated me okay. My previous university, Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, I was in the business school there. They treated me great. I intentionally started doing my IQ research before I got tenure. I just really wanted to see how the profession would treat me, right? I was just running an experiment. I always knew I could get another job. I mean, I was trained in time series econometrics. So I ran the experiment, and it worked out great. So even if it had turned out half as well as it did, I would still be very happy with this career choice. I mean, George Mason is a wonderful, wonderful place to be. I have incredible support from my colleagues, even those who disagree with me strongly, and I support them as well. We back each other up, and for the cause of intellectual freedom and intellectual diversity.
Most interesting economics department in the world, by far.
It's a fascinating place to be.
Yeah, here. And the final audience question before our three is, if you were dictator for a day, or perhaps for a year, or indefinitely, which policies would you implement? And why?
Oh, that's a great one. I'll take two favorite ones from 10% Less Democracy. One is that I would change the United States Senate and the upper houses of all these countries, and change them from being a Senate, a house of the old, into being a sapientum, the house of the wise. So keep our lower houses where you have unlimited voting rights for everyone, and have the upper houses be a place where, say, only college graduates or people over 30 or 35 can vote. Have that body serve as some kind of embodiment of whatever proxies for mediocre wisdom in your culture, right? That discussion within the halls of power between the masses and some proxy of the elites, I think, would improve our governance across the rich countries. So turning senates into sapientums, house of the old into a house of the wise. And again, neither of them are perfect measures, but it'd be better than the status quo. The second one is I try to find a way to give bondholders, people who invest in your country in the long run, give them a more formal voice in the government. The United States Treasury, we should have a Council of Treasury bondholders that meets every 6 months, and they can have non-binding resolutions that are weighted by how many how much skin in the game they have, and just to let them know that they have a focus. These people holding 10, 20, 30-year bonds have an interest in the financial long-run health of the U.S. that very few voters can really bring themselves to think about in any credible way. So long-run focus, wiser voters along socially acceptable dimensions. That's what I do.
Now, it's at this point that we give you a sneak preview of the 3 special questions we ask each guest at the end of the show. Is Brian the smartest person you've ever met? And if not, who is?
Oh, this is great. Oh, so unfair.
So unfair.
And it's a fascinating book by an economic historian. He shaped me because he talked about cultural factors shaping the wealth of nations, while also understanding a lot about the rise of technology.
So if you would like access to all of our guests' answers, the opportunity to submit questions to our guests, early access to the podcast, narrated versions of our articles, and much more, support us today from just $5 a month or $50 a year. Well, this has been such a fascinating discussion, and I think we could easily go for another hour. So you're going to have to come back on, I think, Garett. But thank you so much for joining us. It's been great.
Thanks
for
Garett.
having me.